This is a film about how Gregory Bateson thought. He was always learning from everyone and everything around him, from the dog, from the fish tank, from the scientists who came to visit, from poetry, from artwork, from me. And as a child, I learned from him that learning never stops.
It is more than fashionable. It is inculcated by our great universities, who believe there is such a thing as psychology, which is different from sociology, and such a thing as anthropology, which is different from both, and such a thing as aesthetics or art criticism, which is different from both, all three, all four, whatever, and that the world is made of separable items of knowledge in which, if you were a student, you could be examined by a series of disconnected questions called true or false quizzes, quiz bits, as you might say. And the first point I want to get over to you is that the world is not like that at all, or let us be more polite. The world in which I live is not like that at all. And as to you, it's your business to live in whatever world you want to.
Gregory Bateson challenged us to rethink or to stand back and try to perceive in a different way, to see how reality is actually operating. How does biology work? How do we work? How does even our own thinking get determined by larger ideas?
When finally one of his ideas went ka-thunk and fell into place, the waves, like the whale flapping its tail, were enormous and just echoed out into all these different disciplines. So his inspirational quality was really quite extraordinary.
That he worked in so many disciplines is a consequence of his way of thinking. He was not interested in specializing in a narrow field. He was interested in larger patterns. He was interested in how things are connected, and especially how living things are connected.
From biology at the beginning, into anthropology, into systems of ideas, pathologies of systems of ideas, and then to systems of ideas which are how we all try to live together. And we all includes the animals and the plants as well as you and me.
Looking at just how reality unfolds and how it all works. And when you take a little piece of it, then you just look at that little piece and you come up with a lot of erroneous interpretations of what's going on.
I once spent hundreds of hours looking at a film of a family therapy session. And there was a mother and a father and the child who was the identified patient and a psychotherapist. And that child was bizarre behavior, disruptive, and I thought, oh, that child is making his parents miserable. What an awful thing. And then after I'd watched it another 100 times, I thought, it's that mother that's making the child behave that way. Another 100 times, and I thought, and that father's sitting there, you think he's not doing anything. He's the one that's causing all the trouble. And then eventually I thought, I think it might be the psychotherapist. The point being that the pathology was not in the child or the mother or the father or the therapist. It was in the system. It was in the pattern of relationship between them. And I was trying to attach it to an individual, which is the way we are trained to think about causation.
What happens is that when you breach a holistic structure and you say, or do it without saying it, but you say, I am only going to attend to this end of the relationship. I am going to study the role of the doctor, R-O-L-E. Now, a role is a half-assed relationship, you know. It's one end of a relationship. And you cannot study one end of a relationship and make any sense. What you will make is disaster.
His father, William Bateson, was a biologist and a geneticist. And in fact, William Bateson coined the term genetics. He was a formidable intellect and was, as Gregory put it, ready for the ideas of the 20th century in the 1800s. He read Blake and Shakespeare to his boys at the breakfast table and sought through his plants and his studies for the genius of nature. You might be surprised to learn that the heavy doses of science that the Batesons took on were inspired by the arts. They saw the arts as extensions of the masterpiece that nature is.
He studied life wherever he could, whether it was the play of dolphins or the dance ceremonies of a Balinese tribe or the growth of a shell or a crab, whether it was the behavior of an alcoholic or a schizophrenic. All those were fields that tremendously interested him because they are various manifestations of life that he studied.
This was in 1924, I was in Galapagos, and failed almost completely to find out what a zoologist would do in the field. I was clear I didn't want to live in a lab. I was clear that I didn't know what field zoology meant, and nobody else did. I looked around, and in a year and a half, I was on my way to New Guinea as an anthropologist. There was no training you could give then. There wasn't any anthropology you could train anybody in.
It was in New Guinea that Gregory met renowned anthropologist Margaret Mead.
We began to get an idea. We was then me and Margaret Mead, we were married. We began to get an idea of, I suppose, the affective systems, the emotional systems of a culture. What's now, I think, called value systems.
Well, it was pioneering work in several ways. During that field trip to Bali and New Guinea, Gregory was the one taking the photographs. And he took photographs and he took movies. And always in the past, for instance, when Margaret went to Samoa, she took a Brownie box camera and she probably took 50 photographs. When Margaret and Gregory went to the field, they really wanted to document behavior in a brand new way. Gregory took 50,000 photographs.
During World War II, the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, engaged Gregory to use his knowledge of patterns and culture to manipulate intercepted messages and disrupt communication within the Axis powers. They used his abilities in ways which were antithetical to everything he'd worked toward, and it broke his heart. It was not until after the war that Gregory was revived by the remarkable events of the Macy conferences, where a whole new kind of conversation between scientists and artists took place, and cybernetics was born.
He is one of the founders of this whole school of systems thinking, together with Norbert Wiener and Margaret Mead and John von Neumann and a lot of other scientists.
It was sort of delightful because it was a sense of a bunch of personalities who had a new tool in common, and they were coming from all sorts of disciplines. And that was one of the great attractions. This is one of the few cases where interdisciplinary approach really, really was real and really paid off.
How could you imagine them even being in the same room having a conversation? I think probably a lot of arguments. What came of that group was the trunk of the tree that became computers and the internet and everything else.
Cybernetics was a science developed to describe processes taking place in complex systems, interactions, organization, communication, control. What's happening? How are the different parts of a system connecting to each other?
And it is partly the realization that you have a system, and when you poke it here instead of something happening there, it happens that way, or in a barely recognizable dimension. And that's because it's a very complex system, which has feedbacks and all these things in it. But the complexity is going to continually baffle you until you just really engage. And what you engage with is cybernetic understanding.
We have been trained to think in ways we hardly notice. Religion, education, and culture all filter and frame our perception.
The big challenge that Gregory puts out is to challenge your own perception, your own, what you think is really happening, like that experiment with Ames that he liked to talk about. Now I see what I see isn't really what I see. It's quite different.
If I'm of the belief, for instance, that that there really is some object, there really is objectivity to the fullest extent, and that actually would mean that that coffee cup on the table is being rendered identically in your head as mine. And we know now, even with fMRIs, that is just not the case. And for us to believe it's really the same thing, and for us to argue, is pointless. It's absolutely pointless. The way you make sense of that coffee cup and the way I make sense of that coffee cup, different, but it's still a coffee cup. And I think that we'd have a little more peaceful earth, really, if we had that perspective, that I would respect the fact that you have a different sense-making of that coffee cup than mine. In fact, I would want to learn about it. And we do that through conversation.